So this lecture will cover the preschool years, and specifically we're going to look at the best ways to support preschoolers as they expand their language.
Now, in terms of the preschool years, we talked about over-regularizing in Chapter 2, and then children tend to still do this in the preschool years. So they'll say things like camed, for came over, didded, wented, breaked. Children will use keyword sentences like what at, or eat 'em, or me all finish milk. Questions tend to be typical in the preschool years. We have overextension, where children will call every four-footed furry animal a dog, and then all large animals, they'll call it a horse. And then we also may have underextension, where some children tend to call all male adults daddy, and they don't actually mean that they think that that other person's daddy is their daddy. They just don't know any other way to express so-and-so's daddy. So they'll just say all male adults, they'll call him, oh, the daddy. They'll just say daddy. They'll call all dogs Sparky, and that's even when they know that that's not his actual dog. That's an example of underextension. So we see these in the very early preschool years. Other things that we see in the preschool years, we know that young preschoolers are only 40 to 80% correct in articulation. That's something that generally adults tend to find kind of funny when we see children making articulation mistakes. We think generally that it's comical and amusing, especially when it's our own child, and it's because it's developmental. We know that in general, most young preschoolers cannot articulate correctly. Dramatic play is an important part of speech at this stage. That inner world that they're in, that they share with their friends, helps grow and develop their speech. For older preschoolers, we see that friendships become more complex, and their speech, of course, becomes more complex. We see that group play starts to make an appearance and becomes a little bit more organized, and they'll create words. They'll say Turner over for pancake Turner. They'll say mud putters for rain boots. My own son, for whatever reason, called water wings arm noodles. I guess he saw the other, the big noodles that you can use to float with, and he thought, well, there's something on my arm that helps me float, so he just, on his own, started calling them arm noodles. And every family has lots of stories like these for created words. Again, it's one of the things that we find so charming about preschoolers is that they do these things. Children will also use nonsense words in the preschool years. They think that that's pretty entertaining. And something that's important to know about the preschool years is that speech and intelligence are not actually related particularly closely at this age at all. A lot of times what happens with young children is when they're very verbal, we tend to think, oh, they're so bright, they're so smart. But some children are just, they're just thinking a lot, and there's kind of a personality component that they're just more, they're quieter. They're still processing language, and they still might have a lot to say later on. You might look at those two children in 5th grade and never know that one in a 3-year-old classroom was extremely silent, and the other seemed to have lots to say about absolutely everything. But that tends to be kind of a human characteristic that we have anyway. People that are well-spoken we tend to think of as smarter. But the research shows us that early speech and IQ tests are not particularly closely related, so it's important to not make assumptions about our young children that are silent. The other thing to think about, too, is that when children are exposed to more than one language, they tend to have language delays. And what tends to happen here is that parents sort of flip out, and teachers do too, when they say, oh, my 2.5-year-old seems to have nothing to say. And really what we know from the research is that that's very common. When a child is learning 2 languages, they're taking it all in. And then when they do speak, or when they do speak more, that they have a comprehensive vocabulary in 2 languages. But again, we tend to have like a really early knee-jerk reaction. Oh my gosh, we need to work on English. My child has a speech delay. But we know from the research that these delays are widely recoverable. And it can happen not just with multiple languages, but even having access to a language-rich environment where a child is hearing quite a lot of words all of the time. that happens. But neither of those things are bad. It's great to expose children to lots and lots of language. So what then is the purpose of private speech? Well, researchers talk about multiple reasons. And remember, we said in the earlier lecture that Vygotsky started to address this also as a social piece. But we know that talking to ourselves is a way to give ourselves direction for our intended actions. Okay, well, up here I need to make a left, and then I need to turn around, and then I need to go right at the light. So it's you're giving yourself directions, and that idea, we would say, is why preschoolers are engaging in private speech. In addition, we could say that children need a sensory motor activity, like talking, as a reinforcer or a crutch because their cognitive schemes are not yet well enough developed to be able to do that alone. That's kind of a Piagetian approach to, Piaget said, well, your private speech is a reflection of where you're at cognitively, and so if you're having to talk, then you're using it as a crutch. And then the third idea is to think that it's more efficient to talk through ideas in words rather than silently. So this issue of looking at the purpose of private speech highlights an important distinction between Piaget's theory and Vygotsky's theory in terms of looking at, is it a tool, is private speech a tool, or is it a mirror, is it a reflection of what children already have going on in their heads? Perhaps it's both, but what we do know from the research is that these three reasons have been clearly identified as ways that children are using their private speech. So as younger preschoolers get older, these are some of the things that we can expect to see in terms of their language development. We can expect to see longer sentences with more words per sentence. We can start to see more specificity, so sentences will become more specific. We'll hear more ing endings on verbs, so run will turn into running. We'll hear increased correctness in the forms of the verb to be, so they'll start to say I have instead of I has, and it becomes a little bit more correct. Using auxiliary verbs, using passive voice verbs, including did and been. We start to see changes in negative sentences from, we'll go from no want to I don't want that. And we start to see changes in the forms of questions. So children will start to say, where did the car go? Where before they used to just say, car go? And we see changes in mental categories. They start classifying things, birds and dogs and horses, and it becomes more complex as they start to think about people in their lives and the types of things that they're exposed to. We also see additional clarifications in the articulation of speech sounds. So they become more able to pronounce speech sounds that maybe they couldn't before. So maybe the L that was pronounced like a Y starts to sound like an L. So we start to say little instead of yiddle. So we start to see more sophistication in terms of the speech that older preschoolers are able to use. The consume, critique, produce model really looks at what the tasks of a toddler and a preschooler are. When we think about consumption, critiquing, and production of literature, what we mean here is that we want children to learn all three of these skills. So for example, preschoolers should learn to consume literature, and of course consuming means just taking something into yourself. And of course, we want to read to children over and over again many different kinds of books, fiction books, fantastical books, books that help us reason through the world, like bibliotherapy, to try to figure out how something is affecting me personally, and lots and lots of different kinds of books. And children should hear adults reading books aloud in a variety of fashions. So it's not just the quiet book on one person's knee, but also kind of the more dramatic, fluent, kind of play acting, storytelling that some adults are so proficient at. Often educators, we're very good at telling stories with funny and animated voices, and that's really important for children also, because it again teaches them to consume literature, to really hook into literature as something that's important for them personally and that is entertaining. So we want them to consume literature. Now this is the part that we're all best at. We're all good at reading to children. We all know that children need to be exposed to lots of different kinds of literature. Here's the part that we're working on, critiquing literature. Preschoolers need to have opinions, learn to have opinions about literature. We need to have opinions about what we read. We can ask children for their opinions regarding what they read. Well, what did you think about that? Did you think the wolf was mean when he was trying to blow their houses down? We want kids to have opinions about what they read and to be able to say, I like it, I didn't like it, and to express why. That was scary. I didn't like it. I didn't like the wolf. And this is a critical part to learning how to produce your own literature. When children do not learn to critique other people's literature, then they have a harder time creating their own stories. So that's why this step in the middle is so very important. It's so important to ask children what they think about the stories that they hear. Asking children what they think and exposing to children to lots of different types of literature helps children to produce their own literature. When we give children the time and opportunity to engage in dramatic play, they create their own stories. Children's stories are so important. We know that they're roundabout and nonsensical and long and have many twists and turns, but it's such an important part of learning that you have a voice that needs to be heard. What a great charge we have when we work with young children, when we teach them that their stories are important. When we encourage them to tell stories, even when it's in the play area, even when they're holding up, the little figurine of a fireman and saying, "My fireman is on the fire truck." This teaches children to learn how to be storytellers, and it teaches them in a very early way that they are authors, that they have something to say, and that somebody wants to hear that. And children who really know that are going to have an easier time later on being able to articulate those thoughts and express them on paper. In terms of how we can help support young children in their speech development in these preschool years, we know that it comes down to a few key things. You want to give attentive interaction, positive feedback. You want to react to the intent of a child's message. That's more important than correcting every little word that they say, because of course we know they're going to make errors, but if you're reacting to the child with this attentive, loving interaction, then that's going to be very helpful. You also want to build vocabulary by naming objects and encouraging children to notice how different things are similar and helping them gain new information about the world, helping children see details and relationships in what they encounter. That's very helpful. And it's better than, if it's done just as a matter of contact through that attentive interaction instead of, I'm trying to teach you something. It's when it's natural, it's more long-lasting and more effective. And then connecting any past events to present events may aid their understanding. Oh, look, it's raining. Remember when it was raining the other day? How it was so wet and kind of chilly. So anytime you're able to connect past events to present events, that's going to be helpful. And of course, having children's hearing checked regularly becomes an important aspect for them as well. When we look at physical development, we know, of course, that physical development limits or aids capabilities that affect children's perceptions of themselves. So, for example, a child who has a language disorder becomes over time aware of that as they move into preschool, and that affects how they interact socially with other children. And then we also know, of course, that the reverse is also true. So when there's something going on in a child's world, that also impacts their physical development as well. So those two areas are tied together. Overall, when we look at physical development, we know that preschoolers grow at a rate of about 2 to 3 inches in height and about 4 to 6 pounds in weight per year. At 18 to 24 months, a child's thumb is used in opposition to just one finger. This is an important hallmark for physical development because it helps children to be able to prepare for writing. And then we see that continues to progress. Our ability to use tools and drawing markers with skill starts to emerge. And then in order to support this type of development, we see that preschools and early learning programs plan a wide range of motor activities. Much of children's time is devoted to playing with interesting equipment in indoor and outdoor areas. So all of the kinds of things that we do to help children with, let's say, their fine motor skills, like playing with Play-Doh or stringing beads or manipulating small objects, helps children to develop those fine motor skills that they're going to need to use for writing. And then also their outdoor play, their gross motor play, we also find is connected to literacy because it's connected to overall physical development. And particularly in the early years, we see that that is an important part of this dynamic system of development, where we would say that physical and social, emotional, and cognitive are all related. And while sometimes we remember that the social emotional component is related to the cognitive, which of course is manifested in a child's literacy skills, we forget how important that physical realm is. If a child is sleeping, if a child has appropriate and adequate nutrition, if they have opportunities to stretch and play and run and develop all of those skills that they need in the physical realm. We do see that in the research, school readiness, where a child is showing that they in fact are ready to start school. So at kindergarten entry, they're what we call ready to learn. They have a whole set of skills that indicate that. So they have some in the language arts area, some letter recognition. They can follow two-step directions, things like that. And we see actually that school readiness appears to be linked to physical growth and development. In terms of physical development and perceptual development, which is perception is one area of physical development that we look at. We see that as children move from infancy into preschool, they're using their five senses, their perceptual acuity increases. Of course, we've been using the five senses since birth, but we get better at the acuity skills, so everything increases in sharpness. As we get older, we're more sophisticated at separating out the things that we see and hear. And so, of course, children are exploring their world with their five senses, what they see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. One of the things that we try to remember in our early learning centers is that a child's conceptual tempo identifies different individual pacing and perceptual exploration of objects. What tends to happen is that we see that some children are kind of impulsive in terms of their exploration. So they're quick to answer, they react to a simple or complex situation or problem kind of without hesitating. And the good thing about that is that these children dive right in and they try to solve their problems, right away. And then other children are reflective. They sit back, they take time to weigh aspects or alternatives in a given situation. They like to check it out, scope it out before they dive in. And what we often see in early learning classrooms is that teachers that tend to be more impulsive seem to value that more in children and try to foster that. And teachers that are more reflective tend to value that and notice that. But in fact, either of these approaches are certainly fine, and what we need to do is give children room to dive in if that's what they want to do, and also to sit back and think and give kids the gift of time as well. There are some stages to think about in terms of perceptual development. These are based on Piagetian stages. The sensory motor period is from birth to about 18 to 24 months. We know that during this time, the reflex actions become coordinated. They start to become perfected by physical movement, and we explore real objects and events. So what happens in the sensory motor period is we start off with a reflex, and then we discover almost by accident, hey, that was fun. When I knocked my knee into that, it lit up and made music. I'm going to do that again. And that tends to be what happens in the sensory motor period. Well, then we move toward intentional behaviors. And that's how we are perceiving our world, how we're learning through our perceptual development. In the preoperational period, which starts somewhere between 18 to 24 months, depending on the child, as a child is exiting sensory motor, they enter preoperational. And it lasts to about 7 to 8 years, although some people do feel that children are starting to enter the preoperational period maybe closer to 6 years or so. But in any case, we know that mental symbols represent what is experienced. And as the child matures, the meanings attached to these symbols grow and become detailed and precise, and physical actions combine with mental actions. When we talk about mental symbols, really the big headline here in pre-operational is the whole world of language. That we're really learning to speak in a way that is efficient and fluid and communicates many different shades of meaning. It's amazing how far we come in terms of our language acquisition from the beginning of the pre-operational period to the end of the pre-operational period, regardless of whether we think that end is closer to 8, closer to 6, or right in the middle at 7. So concrete operational, we think definitely is in the early elementary years, and according to Piaget it was 7 to 8 years, and it lasts to about 11 or 12 years. And during the concrete operational phase, a child's thinking is less dependent on physical involvement or immediate perceptual cues that aid tasks like classifying, ordering, grouping, numbering, and inner or cross subgroupings of concepts. And so what we see is that a child can start to think in more abstractions. They're not particularly efficient at abstract thinking, but the fact is that they can think about something even if there's not some kind of physical cue right in front of them. And we know that just as there's gradually increasing control over language, movement, and body control in the preschool years, that there's a similar continuing increase in the ability to scan new material, organize our perception of it, remember it, refer to it by some label, or assign meaning in some other way. So in other words, as we're learning language, as we're refining our movement, as we're engaging in our body control, this dynamic system of action would also enhance our cognitive thinking skills as we're building those other skills. So how do we foster language arts growth in classroom centers through physical development? Well, many centers identify a series of sequential activities and they label them as perceptual or sensory motor. You may have seen this in some classroom settings. And we have there as a main goal is skill development. So we say, well, we're going to work on, let's say, our fine motor skills, and this is a sensory motor skill or it's a perceptual skill, focusing, let's say, on touch and sight, and we're going to string beads, and that's the reason that we're doing it, is to build this skill. In other centers or classrooms, what we'll see is that every activity perhaps is seen as developing perceptual or motor skills, and so it's kind of thought of differently. Some other settings include an emphasis in music or in language arts, and the bottom line is, it's like the old expression, a rose by any other name. As long as the perceptual motor activities are happening, then that certainly is helping children to develop the skills that they need to prepare them for language. And so what's important is that this type of emphasis is part of every center's program, every classroom. Here are some examples that are listed for you of the types of activities that you'll see in many early learning settings that help to support the kinds of skills that impact growth systems for early language ability. Any type of activity where children are developing an awareness of their self in space or in relation to objects, anything that works on flexibility, body coordination, posture and balance, spatial awareness, rhythmic body movement. It's very important to keep our music and movement in our programs. Identifying objects and surfaces with eyes closed, or feely boxes, or little smell canisters with holes poked in it, things like that that help children to identify using just one sense. Awareness of temperature by touch, tracing form outlines with fingers, discriminating color, shape, similar features, different features, size, texture, sounds, matching a wide variety of patterns and symbols, identifying parts of figures or objects when a small part of a whole is presented, eye-hand coordination, and then familiarity with some important terms. Same, different, long, longer, longest, small, smaller, smallest, big, little, tall, short, wide, narrow, high, low, above, below, on, in, hard, soft, sweet, salty, and sour. Identifying food by tasting, identifying smells, and identifying common sounds. In terms of language and cognitive development, Vygotsky had some very interesting things to say. Vygotsky said that language is an actual mechanism for thinking. He said it is a mental tool, and that language makes our thinking more abstract, flexible, and independent from immediate stimuli. And Vygotsky said, well, children use private speech when a task is difficult and children don't know how to proceed. And private speech helps us accomplish a task. And Vygotsky believed that our private speech changes with age by becoming softer or being just a whisper, and it goes underground into inner speech. So Vygotsky believed that children construct their knowledge, which is very similar to Piaget, and we'll contrast these two in a minute. Vygotsky said that development cannot be separated from its social context. Vygotsky's theory is called sociocultural learning, so he really emphasizes that learning takes place in a social context, so in interaction with others and what we're learning from other people. And he also says that learning leads our development. So Vygotsky said, well, if you stimulate oneself cognitively and you're constructing your knowledge, then it leads development in other areas. And he said that language plays a central role in mental development. So in other words, the process of speaking, the process of repeating, the process of talking actually strengthens the mental representations, the mental structures that you have cognitively. So he actually said that language is a tool. If you imagine that your brain is made up of bricks, Vygotsky imagined that language helps you to pick up a brick and to place it into your head. But he also believes that somebody else is helping to hand you the bricks, helps to put the pile of bricks in front of you. So there's definitely that social piece of it. And Vygotsky, in order to support this idea that language is a mental tool, said, well, when children use private speech, it's because it's something they don't know how to do. When they're learning to tie their shoes, they'll say, first you loop the bunny ears, and then you loop the other one over, and then you pull it through. And indeed, that is how children talk when they're trying to learn a difficult task. But you'd never hear a child say, well, first you put the fork in your mouth, because that's something that they have mastery of. Children use private speech when they don't know how to do something, and they're reasoning through it. They're trying to help themselves figure that out. And he also says, well, everybody does it. It's just that it happens in your head. So when you're standing in the checkout line thinking, well, after I get done paying for this, then I'm going to drop the library books off at the library, and then I'll run to the cleaners, and then I'll run through the drive-through. And Vygotsky says, well, we all continue to do that because when we do that when we're trying to solve a task. You'd never hear an adult tying their shoes saying, first you put the bunny ears together and then you loop one over. He says, we do this when we are talking to ourselves because we're trying to solve a task. We do this when we are in downtown Washington, D.C., and we're faced with all kinds of one-way streets and we're not sure how to get to where we're going. Then we start talking to ourselves. So this part of Vygotsky's theory, where he talks about language being a mechanism for thinking, definitely passes our common sense test. Now, in contrast, Piaget talks about children speaking aloud in the presence of others, but they adapt their speech to take into consideration the hearer. But then at other times, they seem to direct their remarks to no one in particular, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence that the child is attempting to take into account the knowledge or interests of the specific listener. And where Vygotsky called talking to yourself private speech, Piaget calls it egocentric speech. And he says, well, this is the inability of the child to separate their own perspective from those of other people. And Piaget did not think that egocentric speech had a function. He felt that it had no apparent function in the child's behavior, and for that reason it doesn't survive, eventually fading away as the child becomes more aware of the distinctions between themselves and others. And so Piaget felt that when it comes to egocentric speech, he felt that language reflects thought, that it doesn't shape it, that it's not helping you to put a brick in your head, it's just showing you how many bricks are in there. And that our cognitive structures, or the shape of the bricks in our head that we're building, because we're constructing our own learning with both of these theories, that they limit and define what we're able to say. And he did say development is social, and he said, well, egocentricity shows that a child is imperfectly adapted socially. And the child will develop into being a mature social being from being an immature one, considering the role of the hearer. Now, Piaget did not mean this in any kind of a disparaging way. He just said, well, you have to love children and know where children are at, and where they're at is they have no regard for the hearer. They are egocentric. And this private speech, well, egocentric speech, as he called it, is just a reflection that this is where a child is at. They're egocentric and they are not really able to take into consideration what is happening around them. So it doesn't matter to them if their egocentric speech is convenient or not for the hearer. So that was kind of what he was focused on. And certainly it is true that children are in an egocentric stage developmentally. But it's very interesting that he did not think that language had a function, that he thought it was just merely a reflection of how far the child has come developmentally. So again, if you compare Vygotsky and Piaget, Vygotsky believes that language is a tool, and you can think of it like a shovel for lifting information and pouring it into your head. But Piaget believed that language is a reflection of the mental process that is already established in the child's cognitive schemes. So for Piaget, he would say, well, it's just a mirror. The Piagetian concept of classification helps us to identify what it is and how it is that children are learning. Now, in terms of classification, we know that each child interprets happenings and attempts to connect each of these happenings with what he or she already knows. And if it fits, then the child understands and it all falls together. There is in your book an example of blowing a horn. At first, a child doesn't necessarily know what blowing the horn is going to do, but then after a child tries it, then they can make sense of the experience and repeat the experience. Children tend to classify events, people, and objects. We all do. Every time we learn something new, we kind of classify it in our head. We put it in its own special little file folder and connect it to something. So, for example, a 9-month-old wouldn't necessarily have a word associated with what the child knows about the horn, but you can still see that a child has a mental class of horns if he reacts by trying to blow into a new toy horn. Okay, so if they see a horn, then it means they've probably seen one before and have in their head, kind of a little folder of, oh, if I blow into that, it'll make a sound. And then we can be relatively sure that the child is forming a class of horns mentally. There are two key concepts in Piagetian theory, assimilation and accommodation. And assimilation and accommodation help us to understand what he's talking about in terms of classification. Now, in assimilation, what's perceived in the outside world is incorporated into the internal world. Now, I'm not necessarily using Piagetian terminology here, but I want you to understand it. And so what we do is we incorporate something into the internal world without changing the structure of the internal world. So we might end up squeezing the external perceptions to fit. So we get into pigeonholing and stereotyping with assimilation. So we see something new, we make some assumptions about it, we pigeonhole, we squeeze it in, we make it fit into the cognitive structures that we already have in our head. Now, in accommodation, the internal world has to accommodate itself to the evidence with which it is confronted and adapt to it, which can be a more difficult and painful process. So if you think about it as a database, it's like what happens when you try to put in new information that does not really fit the pre-existing fields and categories. You have to develop new ones to accommodate the new information. So in assimilation, you're trying to squeeze into something that's already there without changing anything but that bit of information. In accommodation, somebody somewhere has to make room. In the same way, you can think of it like if house guests come to visit you, if you accommodate them, it means that you're altering something. You alter your routine, maybe you have different kinds of food in your refrigerator, maybe you move around sleeping arrangements. That's accommodation because you're making changes. If you were assimilating, then your house guest would show up and you would say to the house guest, you need to assimilate into my system. So sleep wherever you find room, but don't disrupt what's already happening. Eat what you can, but, we haven't gone out of our way to make anything special for you, and we're not going to alter our routine. So you're going to need to squeeze in where there is room. With accommodation, we go out and we make room. With accommodation, we shuffle people around in the house, that sort of thing. More on assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation, again, means you blend in with what's already there, like the expression do in Rome as the Romans do. Now, if a child thinks that all birds fly, and then you take them to the zoo and they see an ostrich, they'll most likely assimilate the information by thinking, oh, that's a broken bird. So you'll take this child to the zoo, and most, let's say 2-year-olds, have seen birds, and they think of birds as, well, things that fly. They might even think of birds and airplanes in the same category. And the fact is that they'll think all birds fly. That is a mental class that the average 2-year-old would probably have. Now, the first time they see that ostrich again, they're going to say, well, all birds fly, so that their ostrich is broken. That is a broken bird. And they're still going to fit it into the file folder in their head that says birds fly. They'll just squeeze it in by changing the information about that bird. Well, that bird's broken, but all birds fly. Now, if you keep walking through the zoo with the same 2-year-old, and then the 2-year-old sees another non-flying bird, let's say a chicken, then accommodation means that you're going to make room for something new. So when you are forced to assimilate more than once, then you start to say, well, okay, maybe there are birds that don't fly. So, the child then sees the non-flying bird and says, well, that's more than one broken bird. So maybe there are some birds that don't fly. So then they'll create a new file folder that says birds that fly, and then all of the birds that child has seen before, sparrows, crows, eagles, will fit into that folder. And then in the new folder, birds that don't fly, the child will put ostriches and chickens. And then that's how the child creates a new space in their brain to classify birds as birds that fly and birds that don't fly. In terms of maturity, this is another element, another growth system that impacts children's language. We know that there are different capabilities for different children, and we know that make-believe is internal intellectual creation and or recreation. This is a very important part of language learning, the world of make-believe. Children express themselves deeply and thoroughly through make-believe. And this is actually an important precursor to a child feeling that they are an author. Preschool children's statements that seem to be errors in thinking can be seen as a natural part of development. So when we see that preschool children think that they too will be able to fly if only they try hard enough, or that if they open an umbrella that the wind will take them off into the air like Mary Poppins, these are not so much errors in thinking as they are just a natural part of development. We should expect this. It is actually part of the charm of childhood. I remember when my nephew, who was he was at the end of his 3rd year, just close to turning 4, he was absolutely convinced that if he tried hard enough, he would be able to breathe fire. And I remember the day that he said, "Oh, but I want to breathe fire, and I want to be a dragon, but every time I try, only spit comes out." And that was just a reflection of where he was at in terms of his development and his statement in his own world of make-believe. We know that children's view of the world is based on immediate present happenings and then their beginning thought processes. So they can only express what they know and what they've learned, which means that whatever they're expressing is exciting because they're using words to kind of move along and tell us what they know and show us what they've learned. And it's also a great challenge to us too, because if we have immediate present happenings that are enriching, then that deeply impacts the beginning thought processes of the children that we work with. The role of the teacher in supporting children are as follows. We know that sensory motor experiences and social experiences are very important for cognitive growth. And we want to support children with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development that's talked about in the book by helping children with tasks that are just out of their reach. If you have a task that is just a little bit difficult, then it's challenging and rewarding to work on it. Something too easy eventually gets boring, and something too hard gets frustrating. But when you keep kids in the zone of proximal development, that's the best spot in terms of supporting their growth and development. We certainly want to ask children why they think the way they do. That reveals so much about what it is that they have going on in their little minds and how they're perceiving and seeing the world. Piaget talks about how children should concentrate on discovery techniques. Children do need to develop their own theories about how things operate. They need to learn by doing. And then finally, metalinguistic skills are the ability to think about language. When we see that children are starting to play with language and words and make comparisons between spoken and written words and between different words, between one word to another word, then we know that that is an important leap forward in terms of their language development because they are thinking about language, and that's an important hallmark of development. In terms of social and emotional growth, we know that issues related to speech have an impact on social and emotional development and vice versa. When we are shocked or dismayed or even very excited, we are dumbstruck, even as adults. And of course, our cognitive development, our social and emotional development has had more time to mature over time. So then you can imagine that a child who's having a speech-related issue, for example, stuttering, that has an impact on how the child feels socially and emotionally, and the anxiety that they then feel in terms of speaking. And in fact, stuttering is associated with anxiety, and so the stuttering actually makes the anxiety worse, which makes the stuttering worse. So that's, I think, a good example. And then we also know that that it's interactive. So if a child is feeling something emotionally, it impacts their speech, and if a child is having an issue with speech, then it also impacts them socially and emotionally. Those of us who have worked with young children in a toddler classroom where some children bite certainly know that it's true that oftentimes our biters are children that are so frustrated and they just don't necessarily have the words to express how frustrated they are. And so we know that that is very helpful. And in terms of self-regulation, even teaching a child to say, "I'm so frustrated," helps that child socially and emotionally. In any case, we can see that they are deeply connected. Teachers should be concerned with social connectedness. We want our children to be stable and secure, to develop close relationship with others. We want them to have supportive family and friends, and be deemed a worthy individual by others. All of these elements will have a profound impact on language. So what fosters social and emotional growth in the classroom? Well, we love activities using mirrors. Children love to look at themselves in the mirrors. They love photographs, home movies, tracing our outlines, making name tags and labeling belongings and projects, identifying and discussing feelings. Particularly with our younger preschoolers, we know that they're really just learning how to express their dismay and frustration, and helping them to be able to identify, oh, I see you're feeling sad, helps them then the next time to say, well, I'm sad. We want to be concerned with personal opinions, and then we want to celebrate our similarities and our individual diversities. We want all of those similarities and differences to be celebrated. And we want children to build pride or membership in a group. Classroom cohesion is very important for social and emotional growth in the classroom, because that really helps children to feel like they're a part of something bigger. Everybody loves to belong to a group. So that's an important thing that we can do for the kids. So the final thought for Chapter 4 is written for you here. Essentially, our physical, intellectual, and social emotional growth proceeds concurrently with children's speech.